Okay, Crazy Steve, part two of the story. So we landed at my grandmother's place in Ontario, in the front yard, and my dad was he hopped out of the truck. He was all excited. He wanted to see his mother, so he ran up to the front door, and he banged on the front door, and they all come out. Her, my grandfather, and Steve. Now, my grandfather, he had his fedora hat on, and he had a little feather. He always wore the fedora hat with a little feather, and he had on a button-up shirt, and he always dressed nice and neat. Had nice, neat pants. He had checkered pants on and a pair of nice leather shoes, and he was a real gentleman, my grandfather. My grandmother was dressed up pretty nice too. She come out and she was happy to see my dad, gave him a big hug. So did my grandfather. And all of us, we all hugged one another and everything. Steve kind of stood there and watched, but he come over and he got into it a little bit too. But he was a little bit standoffish, Steve was. But anyway, so we all went into the house. Then we all sat down in the living room, and there was a lot of seats. It's a fairly large living room, and it had a stereo there. She had one of the old stereos that had the records on it, and she had some furniture there. And turns out some of the furniture had been built by Steve. Steve, in the basement, was working with this guy called Ole. And the two of them had minds on starting up a new business to sell what's called Scandinavian design furniture. And they were trying to work together, the two of them. But really what they really were drinking buddies. Him and Ole. Ole, I guess, was about Steve's age, around 30 or 32, 33, along in there. Anyway, so we all sat down in the living room, and Steve, he never wore a shirt. He was like that guy on, well, maybe he wore a shirt in the winter, but he was like that guy on Trailer Park Boys, that guy that doesn't wear the shirt on Trailer Park Boys. I can't think of that guy's name right now. Randy. He's like Randy. He never wore a shirt, He always walked around with no shirt on all summer long, And I guess he wanted to show off his chest, his chest muscles. But anyway, Steve was sitting in the living room with all of us, and we were all sitting there, and talking and everything, and happy to see one another, And my grandmother, she brought in some little cupcakes or something that she had made, and my grandfather, he was sitting there enjoying talking to everybody. My grandfather, he liked to have a little smoke, so I think he rolled one at the time. I can't remember, but I think he did. I think he rolled one and had a little smoke. And smoking wasn't frowned on back then so much, as it is now. But he used to roll his own anyway, so we all had a good time. And later that night, my grandmother cooked supper and everything, and we had a nice dinner. It wasn't long after dinner, though. Steve come up, and he says to me, just after we went into the living room, after we ate, he comes up and he says to me and my pop were sitting next to each other on the couch. He says to us, I want to show you something. Steve says, come on with me, I want to show you something down in the basement. So we didn't know what he wanted to show us. So we followed him down to the basement and walked down the stairs down to the basement. And a long set of stairs going down into the basement. And they were like kind of steep stairs. And there's a little handrail next to them. And the basement had a little bit of a basement-y smell, And it was all painted white. The floor was white and everything. They'd painted the basement white. The top of the trusses were all painted white. Everything was white down there, except for the furnace. There's a great big green-colored furnace down there. And I noticed on the floor, there was a bench press there, and there was a set of dumbbells, and there was a big barbell on the floor, and there's another barbell on the bench press, So Steve says, look at these muscles, he says, once he gets down in the basement. He starts flexing his arms. Look at this. Look how strong I am, he was saying. My father was standing there looking at him, and I was standing there looking at him. He says, look what I can do. And he ran over to the bench, and he started to bench press this weight. So my father was kind of interested at that point. He says, well, Steve, how much weight's on there? I think Steve says like 150 pounds. He's bench pressing it up and down, you know. And he's pretty strong because he wasn't having too much trouble with that 150 pounds on the bench press. And then he sits up onto the bench press and he starts flexing his pecs, you know. And my dad started to have a little bit of a smirky looking smile on his face, kind of smiling my dad was when Steve was doing that, you know. So anyway, I started to think this smile a little bit too, but it was kind of a nervous smile. Anyway, then Steve goes over to the great big dumbbells, the big weight that was on the floor, the big barbell that was on the floor, you know. And he grabs it. He says, "Watch this." And he grabs a barbell, and he picks it up, and he gets it up. He picks it right up in one swift movement. He pretty much take it up to his chin, you know. And then he steps forward and gets under it, and he puts it over his head really high, you know. And he's standing there, and his arms are shaking, and his face really red, and his legs were wobbling, you know. And he had it up there, and then he lets it down with a clang. He says, "You see that?" He says, "That's 140 pounds over my head," he says. You know? He says, "Let's see you do it, Ford." They used to call me Ford back then, you know. That was my nickname. Well, I walked over, and I grabbed a hold of the thing, and I give it a yank to lift it off. And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's heavy. Man, that's ever heavy." I picked it up to about my waist, you know. And I was having trouble with it. Because, I mean, I was only an 18-year-old boy. I hadn't filled out yet, really, you know. I was having a lot of trouble with it. I got it up to my waist, you know. And then I give it a push, and I was able to get it almost up to my chest. But I was really having a lot of trouble with it. So I set it back down on the ground. And then he says to my dad, "Come on, you try, Glenn." Because that's why they call me Ford. Because my dad's name's Glenn, too. Anyway. He says to my dad, he says, "Come on, Glenn, you give it a try." So Glenn comes over, and Glenn grabs a hold of it, you know. And Glenn picks it up, you know. My dad picks it up, and he gets it up to about his waist, and he did it real slow. He was like hesitant to do it. He didn't really want to do it, but Steve was so enthused, you know. He was so full of it. He was like a Hulk, you know. He's like he's going around, walking around us, making these poses, you know. Anyway, so my dad wasn't really into any of this stuff. So my dad picks it up, gets it about to his waist. He says, "I don't want to hurt my back, Steve." Steve says, "No, come on, you can do it." You know, so my dad gives it a little thrust, and my dad got it up about halfway to his chest, and he gave up, and he put it back down on the ground with a big smile on his face, my dad, you know. So like he thought he did pretty good to get it up that far, and I don't think my dad should have done that much, you know. But anyway, my dad gave it a go. So anyway, so Steve comes along, and he grabs a hold of it again, and he yanks it, pushes it up over his head again, you know, and he's just like thunderously triumphant. And he says to me, my dad, he says, "Look how much more powerful I am than you guys, you wimps," you know. And then he clangs it back down on the ground, and he starts to pose like the Hulk. You know, ever seen these like they squeeze their chest muscles, you know, like the weightlifters and stuff. And he was like dancing around the room, and my dad when he was back to, my dad was like chuckling a little bit, like he couldn't help himself. He laugh at Steve, you know. Anyway, so when that was over, Steve proved how strong he was. He went upstairs. He says, "Come on, let's go back upstairs," Steve says. So we both followed him back upstairs, you know, into the kitchen, on the kitchen table, you know. And my grandmother was up there still, and my grandfather and my mother were up there, you know. So Steve had a good audience. So then Steve says to my dad, he says, "I got another test of strength I do," Steve says, "to show how strong I am." He says, "I got this bathroom scale." And he says, "I want you guys to give it a go." He says, I squeeze it all the time. I grab this bathroom scale, I squeeze it with my hands, he says, and I do an amazing amount, he says, because my hands are so strong. He says, "Now watch this." And he went into the other room, and he got this white bathroom scale. It wasn't a big scale, it's just a small little white bathroom scale, you know. And he squeezed it. And he says, look, 100, almost 150 pounds, he says. He says, it's amazing, isn't it, to everybody there. Look how much I can squeeze, 150 pounds. You know, and his face was all red, and he was squeezing that thing for all this worth, and his teeth were all clenched, you know, and everything. And he put it down on the table. He says, let's see you guys try. He says, I bet you can't even make 100, he says, you know. So, because he knew he was stronger, because he lifted the barbell down there, and he lifted more than me or my dad, you know. So, my dad tried first. My dad grabbed the scales, the bathroom scales, and he squeezed it. And to Steve's amazement, it went up to 175 pounds. Steve actually put his hands on top of his head, and he squeezed like his hair, and his hair was coming out between his fingers, you know, on both sides of his head. His hands were both on top of his head like that, and the hair was coming between his fingers, and he was squeezing his head with his hands, you know, and his face all went up, it contorted, it did an awful look on his face, and he was mad. He was awful mad. He grabbed the scale again this time, and I'm telling you, he squeezed it. Steve squeezed it, and he squeezed it. He couldn't get it over 150. He says, how did you do that to my dad? He was mad. He slammed the scale down on the table. And everybody was looking at him like, is he a little bit touched in the head or what? Or what, you know? So anyway, so then he says, Ford, you try it. He says, I want to see what you can do. I grabbed the thing. I don't know how I did it. I don't know why or how it happened, but I squeezed it all the way up to 250 pounds. That put Steve right over the edge. He went into his bedroom and slammed the door behind him. That's when he started hating my guts. And this is when the fun began for me. I shouldn't say fun. In the end, well, anyway, I'll go more into the story. So he went into the bedroom in there, you know, and he was in there for about a half an hour. We all went back to talking in the living room, all works of us. We kind of ignored him. Anyway, I'm just going to say something here, you know. Doesn't every family have a Steve? At least one. And you know, most families anyway have a Steve. I shouldn't laugh. I can only laugh because it happened years ago, you know, a long time ago, back when I was a kid, you know, and everything. But anyway, this is the end of part 2. Listen, thank you guys for listening, and we'll get on to part 3 pretty darn soon. Bye-bye.